the France you know today, the land of the Eiffel Tower, tourism, luxury, and liberty. You know it as a modern powerhouse, with fighter jets like the Rafale soaring across global skies. A nation that leads in fashion, philosophy, and freedom. But what if we rewind the clock 2 centuries, and this same France was drowning in poverty, in hunger, in rage. Its streets weren't lined with cafes. They were echoed and bled with cries for bread. Its rulers weren't elected. They were born into the golden womb, while the people starved in silence. And one day, that silence shattered. The story I'm about to tell today is not just a story of a revolution. This is the story of how ordinary people rose to crush a 1,000-year-old monarchy and chose to rewrite the destiny of the modern world. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the French Revolution.
America bankrupts France, in effect.
Old regime Europe, you were told what to think. You were given information from above.
Basic dangers is it means you will eventually question, why are aristocrats the ones with privilege?
Young King Louis wants revenge for his grandfather's defeats. It is the age of enlightenment.
The idea that monarchy is natural, aristocracy is natural, and hierarchy is natural.
It all started in the year 1774. France, at that time, was ruled by kings and was under an absolute monarchy. People were not treated equally. The society was then divided and discriminated in the most brutal ways possible. Then comes a boy named Louis XVI of the Bourbon dynasty, who inherits the throne and becomes the King of France. He was only 20 years old when he became the king. Louis then decides to marry an Austrian princess called Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was known as a pretty bad advisor to the kingdom as a queen, and she was known to be fascinated by luxury and fashion a lot. Under Louis XVI, France helped the 13 American colonies to gain their independence by wars from the common enemy for both the countries, Britain. The war added more than 2 billion livres to a debt. Livres was the currency of France back then, which was later discontinued in the year 1794. Moneylenders, who gave the state credits and loans, now began to charge 10% interest back on loans. So the French government was obliged to spend an increasing percentage of its budget only on interest payments alone. To meet the country's regular expenses, such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, the running government offices or universities, the state was forced to increase taxes. But this measure was not so sufficient. To understand why, you must understand the term old regime. The old regime was the pyramid of privileges and castes. People at the top were called as the first estate, the clergy. The clergy were the most elitist people of the nation, who majorly consisted of kings, queens, and rulers who were rich in land and influence. The first estate, also known as clergy, were completely relieved and exempted from paying any tax. Below them were the people of second estate, also known as the nobility. The people who were the religious teachers back then, majorly associated with spreading religion and religious teachings. The kings and the rulers, in fact, respected the nobility and were also exempted to pay any tax. The first and the second estate consisted of the top 2% of the French population back then, and the remaining 98% of the people were. The third estate, who comprised of everyone else remaining, peasants, urban workers, lawyers, merchants, small peasants. The third estate was the only class who was alone responsible to pay the taxes, while the clergy and the nobility enjoyed many privileges by birth. The mindset of the French people back then was completely stereotypical. They used to think that the kings and the queens are the people chosen by God, and the rest of them are underprivileged because of their deeds. The population of France rose from about 23 million in 1715 to 28 million in 1789. This led to a rapid increase in the demand for food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand, so the price of bread, which was the staple diet of the majority, rose rapidly. Most workers were employed as laborers in workshops whose owner fixed their wages. But the wages did not keep pace with the rising prices, so the gap between the poor and the rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. This led to a subsistence crisis, something that occurred frequently in France during the period of the old regime. The subsistence crisis is an extreme situation where the basic means of livelihood are endangered. Due to the subsistence crisis, in the past, peasants and workers had participated in revolts against the increasing taxes and food scarcity. But they lacked the means and programs to carry out full-scale measures to the problem of subsistence crisis that would bring about some change in the social and economic order of France. This authority was left to those groups within the Third Estate who had become prosperous and had access to education and new ideas. The 18th century witnessed the emergence of social groups, termed the middle class, who earned their wealth through expanding overseas trade and from the manufacture of goods such as woolen and silk textiles that were either exported or bought by the richer members of society. In addition to merchants and manufacturers, the Third Estate included professions such as lawyers or administrative officials. All of these were educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend on his merit. These ideas sparked an emotion of a society based on freedom and equal laws and opportunities for everybody in France. These ideas were put forward by philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his two treatises of government. Rousseau carried the idea forward, proposing a form of government based on a social contract between people and their representatives. In the book, The Spirit of the Laws, later, a person named Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. This model of government was newly adapted in the United States of America after they got their independence from Britain. The American Constitution and its guarantee of individual rights was an important example for political thinkers in France. The ideas of these philosophers were discussed intensively in salons and coffee houses and spread among people through books, newspapers, and magazines. These were frequently read aloud in groups for the benefit of those who could not read and write. But later, these things provoked the king, Louis XVI, and he planned to impose further taxes to meet the expenses of the state. This also generated anger and protest against the system of privileges and the common men altogether. To increase taxes in France during the period of the old regime, the monarch, who was Louis XVI, did not have the power alone to impose taxes according to his own free will. To impose the taxes, he had to call a meeting, quote, the meeting known as the Estates General, which would then pass his proposals and demand for new taxes. The Estates General was a political body in which the three estates sent their representatives. However, the catch was that the monarch alone could decide when to call a meeting of this body. The last time it was done was in the year 1614. On 5th May 1789, Louis XVI called an assembly of the Estates General to pass proposals for new taxes. A resplendent hall in Versailles was prepared to host the delegates. The first and second states sent 300 representatives each, who were seated in rows facing each other on two sides. But the 600 members of the Third Estate had to stand at the back. The Third Estate this time was represented by its more prosperous and educated members. Peasants, artisans, and women were denied entry to the assembly. However, their grievances and demands were listed in some 40,000 letters brought by the Third Estate. Voting in the Estates General in the past had been conducted according to the principle that each estate had one vote. This time too, Louis XVI wanted to continue the same practice. But members of the Third Estate demanded that voting now shall be conducted by the Assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. This was one of the democratic principles put forward by philosophers like Rousseau in his book, The Social Contract. When the king rejected this proposal, members of the Third Estate walked out of the assembly in protest. The representatives of the Third Estate viewed themselves as spokesmen for the whole French nation. On 20th June, they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles. They declared themselves a national assembly and promised not to disperse till they had drafted a constitution for France that would limit the powers of the monarch and the king Louis XVI. They were led by Mirabeau and Abbé Sieyès. Mirabeau was the person who was born in a noble family, but was convinced of the need to do away with a society of feudal privilege. He brought out a journal and delivered powerful speeches to the crowds assembled at Versailles. Like a politician, Abbé Sieyès, originally a priest who wrote an influential pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? The National Assembly was busy at Versailles drafting a constitution. Versailles was the palace of the France back then. While the work on the constitution was on, the rest of France was affected with a disaster back then. A severe winter had brought a very bad harvest to the country of France. The price of bread increased drastically. Often bakers exploited the situation and hoarded supplies. After spending hours in long queues at the bakery, crowds of angry women stormed into the shops to steal bread. At the same time, the king ordered army troops to move into Paris. On 14th July, the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. In the countryside, rumors spread from village to village that the lords of the manor had hired army troops who were on their way to destroy the ripe and good remaining crops. Caught in a frenzy of fear, peasants in several districts seized hoes and pitchforks and attacked chateaux. Chateau is like a large castle or a country house. There the people of France, generally the people of Third Estate, looted, hoarded grain, and burnt down documents containing records of manorial dues. A large number of nobles fled from their homes, many of them migrating to neighboring countries. Faced with the power of his revolting subjects, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his powers would from now on be checked by a constitution. On the night of 4th of August, 1789, the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. Members of the clergy, too, were forced to give up their privileges. Tithes were abolished and lands owned by the church were confiscated. As a result, the government acquired assets worth at least 2 billion livres. The National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution in 1791. Its main object was to limit the powers of the monarch. These powers, instead of being concentrated in the hands of one person, were now separated and assigned to different institutions: the legislature, executive, and judiciary. This made France a constitutional monarchy. The Constitution of 1791 vested the power to make laws in the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected, where citizens voted for a group of electors, who in turn chose the Assembly. Not all citizens, however, had the right to vote. Only men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage were given the status of active citizens. The remaining men and all women were classed as passive citizens. To qualify as an elector and then as a member of the assembly, a man had to belong to the highest bracket of taxpayers. The Constitution began with a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. Rights such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before law, were established as natural and inalienable rights. That is, they belonged to each human being by birth and could not be taken away, and made sure that it was the duty of the state to protect each citizen's natural rights. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the Constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. Rulers of other neighboring countries, too, were worried by the developments in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking place in France since the summer of 1789. Before this could happen, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 wanted to declare war against Prussia and Austria. Thousands of volunteers thronged from the provinces to join the army. They saw this as a war of the people against kings and aristocracies all over Europe. Among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise, composed by the poet Roger de Lille. It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseille as they marched into Paris, and so got its name. The Marseillaise is now the national anthem of France. The Revolutionary Wars brought losses and economic difficulties to the people. While the men were away fighting at the front, women were left to cope with the tasks of earning a living and looking after their families. Large sections of the population were convinced that the revolution had to be carried further, as the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of society. Political clubs became an important rallying point for people who wished to discuss government policies and plan their own forms of action. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobins. The Jacobins Club got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Women who had been active throughout this period formed their own clubs. The members of the Jacobin Club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society. They included small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. A large group among the Jacobins decided to start wearing long striped trousers, similar to those worn by dock workers. This was to set themselves apart from the fashionable sections of society, especially nobles, who wore knee breeches. It was a way of proclaiming the end of the power held by the wearers of knee breeches. These Jacobins came to be known as the sans-culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. Sans-culottes men wore in addition the red cap that symbolized liberty. Women, however, were not allowed to do so. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food. On the morning of August 10th, they stormed the palace of the Tuileries, massacred the king's guards, and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. Later, the assembly voted to imprison the royal family. Elections were held. From now on, all men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. On 21 September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. As you know, a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government. There is no hereditary monarchy. Then finally, the King Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of betrayal of one's country. On 21st January 1793, he was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. The Queen Marie Antoinette was also killed with the same fate shortly after. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All those whom he saw as being enemies. If the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. The guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. It was named after Dr. Guillotin, who invented it. Churches were shut down and their buildings converted into barracks or offices. Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his supporters began to demand moderation. Finally, he was also convicted by a court in July 1794, arrested, and on the next day, Robespierre was sent to the guillotine and was killed. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. They worked as seamstresses or laundresses, sold flowers, fruits, and vegetables at the market, or were employed as domestic servants in the houses of prosperous people. Most of the women did not have access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the Third Estate could study at a convent, after which their family arranged a marriage for them. Working women had also to care for their families, that is, cook, fetch water, queue up for bread, and look after the children. Their wages were lower than those of men. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. One of their main demands was that women enjoy the same political rights as men. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political office. Only then, they felt, their interests would be represented in the new government. In the early years, the revolutionary government introduced laws that helped improve the lives of women. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. Marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely, and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal and could be applied by both women and men. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists, or run small businesses. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The example of the political activities of French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo, were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. So this was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There, they were sold to plantation owners. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. But it did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. It was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. This, however, turned out to be a short-term measure. 10 years later, a person known as Napoleon Bonaparte reintroduced slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes. It's a term used to describe indigenous people of Africa south of the Sahara. It is a derogatory term not in common use any longer. In pursuit of the African people's economic interests, slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws, such as the protection of private property, and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. But soon the Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. He was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern law had strong impact on the other parts of Europe, and had also had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left. The French Revolution was not perfect, had many ups and downs, but it gave the world something priceless, a belief that liberty is worth fighting for, and that even the smallest voice can bring down a crown. What would you have done in 1789? Would you have marched, spoke out, stayed silent? Let us know in the comments. And if history moves you, subscribe for more stories that change the world. This was the French Revolution.